Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our People Plus Places, Tuna Street Buildings, an Untold Story about LA's Japanese American experience. I'm Adrian Scott Fine, the President and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'm just going to ask everyone if you go ahead and turn off your video. And great, thank you. So thank you for joining us. The Conservancy's People Plus Places series is something that we do. We're now in our 5th year of doing this program. And it's all about people-focused heritage and conservation efforts and us sharing their stories. All of these past People Plus Places programs are available. They live on our YouTube site, so we would encourage you to check them out there. This program itself will also be listed there later this week. While these programs are open to all, we also encourage you to join our membership of 4,500 plus members for even more access to our programs, to exciting new member discounts, and our new member publication called Landmark, with our latest issue featuring a story on the LA fires and the work we are doing to respond, with today, sadly, marking the 4-month anniversary since the fires first started. Today's program is talking about some of the work that the Conservancy's been doing and has been doing for some time with local partners on Terminal Island. As part of this program, we are going to be taking questions afterwards. So I would encourage you to put them into the Q&A box anytime during the program. Like I said, we'll get to them later in the program as we talk more about Terminal Island. And specifically talking about 2 buildings that remain on the island on Tuna Street that tell a very important, vibrant story about this community that once existed on the island here. And we're going to talk about how we share this story, talk about why it's important to keep these historic buildings, and also talk about what remains today and what remains in terms of talking about heritage when so much has been lost. The Terminal Island of today is it's a vastly different place and landscape from what it existed in the 30s and 40s, with the Port of Los Angeles prioritizing cargo container storage over heritage in many cases, especially as this function and use for Terminal Island has changed. It raises questions about places and spaces that radically change over time, and how and why it's important to acknowledge our physical past in a meaningful way. We are going to hear from descendants and ancestors from the Terminal Islanders Association about this community, and also they're going to share about what made it special and memorable and why it's still important today. Few know this story, specifically what unfolded and followed the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and what happened here, and why these, again, 2 surviving historic buildings, the Nakao Shoten 1918 building and the A. Nakamura Company building from 1923, again, both are important to keep, and they're currently in some ways threatened with demolition. Through preservation of these buildings, advocates hope to honor their ancestors and commemorate this dark chapter of American history. We will also talk about a pending historic cultural monument designation effort and next steps. And much of this and much thanks goes to Councilman Tim McCosker for introducing this historic cultural monument action. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a second here and share a little bit more here. But essentially, for the last 15 years, the Conservancy has been working with local partners, including and namely the Terminal Islanders Association, to advocate for the preservation of historic places on Terminal Island, including successfully helping the port adopt a new master plan in 2013 that identified the Tuna Street buildings, the buildings that we're talking about today, as being historic. In 2012, Terminal Island was included on the National Trust list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. And with that, let me start by introducing our panel and the group of guests joining us today, which we have many, and we're very thankful for. They're representing various and numerous backgrounds and doing a lot of good work. So let me start, and please feel free to turn your cameras and unmute yourself as we start the program. We have Paul Hiroshi Boyea, who is with the Terminal Islanders Association. We have Donna, Reiko, Cottrell with the Terminal Islanders Association as well. We also have Terry Hara, also Terminal Islanders Association. We have Naomi Hirahara, co-author, Terminal Island Lost Communities of Los Angeles Harbor. We also have Aksel Palacios from Council District 15, or as we often say, or as your office often says, Council District 15. And then last, we have Carol Quillen, President and CEO, National Trust for Historic Preservation. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, I want to turn it over to Carol to start us off. Carol, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. You would think after years of Zoom, I would learn to unmute myself. But thank you so much, Adrian. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you. I really feel fortunate to be a part of this panel. Now, as you've heard from Adrian, the National Trust has partnered with the LA Conservancy and the Terminal Islanders Association for many years, supporting the preservation of historic places on Terminal Island. Today, I'm pleased to announce that we've included the Terminal Island Japanese American Tuna Street buildings on the National Trust list of America's 11 most endangered historic places for 2025. With this designation, we stand alongside the LA Conservancy, the Terminal Islanders Association, and every individual who believes that this place must be saved for the benefit of ourselves, our children, and future generations. You'll hear more in a moment about the Terminal Island community, but I want to highlight just a few things. Historic places like the Tuna Street buildings hold power, the power to move us, to teach us, to connect us to the past and to each other so that together we can build a shared future worthy of the promise of this nation's founding. We're a nation with global roots. The Japanese immigrants who built the Terminal Island community brought with them strengths, skills, talents, and traditions that shaped our economy and culture in Los Angeles and across the United States. Their resilience, even in the face of horrific circumstances, reminds each American to stand firm for our founding promise: freedom, equality, the rule of law, the dignity and worth of each human being, every day, and especially when we're afraid. Protecting the Tuna Street buildings and lifting up the stories of the community's descendants, the legacy of the folks that built the Tuna Street community. These things are crucial to our national identity and to our shared and just and humane future. And with that, I want to turn it over to Naomi so that we can hear more about the history and the importance of Terminal Island. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Let's see, I'm hoping that people can, let's see my PowerPoint here. Okay, let's play it from the start. So Terminal Island is a tale of success, how human ingenuity, a commercial partnership between city and corporation, and immigrants to California from Eastern Europe, Italy, and Japan led to the creation of the largest fishing enterprise in the United States at one time. It's also a tale of great tragedy, how the power of prejudice, economic greed, and a lack of political leadership led to the dismantling of a community that, ironically, the government had helped to build. The story begins in the 1800s with isolated islands. By the end of World War I, there was a full-blown, very lucrative fishing operation in what was called Fish Harbor, and we're talking mainly about this area right here. Each step of the way, the city interceded to create this man-made landmass. The first Japanese came to work on the railroad system and also harvest abalone in nearby White Point. Many of them came from Japan's Wakayama Prefecture. Observers recognized their skill in catching giant fish like tuna with the use of bamboo poles and barbless hooks. And they also excelled in catching sardines, which glowed under the cover of night. So that was a later achievement. So soon, these Japanese fishermen were recruited by canneries to settle in the newly constructed Fish Harbor. Most of the wives worked on the assembly lines of the same canneries. 2 to 3,000 Japanese Americans lived together in crowded conditions in wood-framed rental houses provided by the canneries. This is kind of too small for you to see the actual names, but some former Terminal Islanders could identify some of the families that lived in this very narrow area. Some visitors, hating the smell of the processed fish, called Fish Harbor an ethnic ghetto, while residents like Charlie Hamasaki described it as an enchanted island. In Fish Harbor, neighbors looked after each other. The priest of the island's Shinto shrine, and this is one of the few Shinto shrines on America's mainland, prayed for the safety of the fishermen. A Baptist mission was established, and that's notable because Terminal Island was almost viewed as a foreign country. And an elementary school later named after the beloved late principal nurtured Nisei children. And one of these children, Paul, is Paul Boyea's mother, the next speaker. And we'll be talking more about businesses and businesses on Tuna Street. Fish Harbor's main drag was launched by Enterprise in Issei. And we've seen this photo before, but it's a Nakamura company, and we'll hear more about that. So all along from the 1920s, Issei fishermen fought state and federal legislation that sought to limit their professional activities because of their ethnicity. So you have to remember, Yugoslavs and Italian fishermen could become naturalized, could become citizens, but the Japanese could not and were often discriminated against. And the Terminal Islands, a very savvy group, even hired lobbyists fluent in English to fight for their rights. In spite of embracing America, okay, and you see in the photo on the right-hand side with the mother and the daughter ironing what's on the wall, but it's a banner that indicates she's a Blue Star mother because her son had been drafted in the U.S. Army in 1941. But in spite of these statements, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, leaders were taken away. Probably the most tragic incident to occur on the island was the February 2nd arrest of every Japan-born fisherman, which included pretty much every fisherman of Japanese descent, including Charlie Hamasaki, the lover of his enchanted island. Charlie and his fellow fishermen were sent to far-flung alien detention centers without their families even knowing where they were in freezing North Dakota as well as Santa Fe, New Mexico. That left Nisei children and their mothers to deal with the aftermath of these arrests. At the end of February, authorities circulated a notice that everyone on the island, including non-Japanese residents, had to pack up and leave in 48 hours. So there was, in a sermon delivered years after the forced removal, Sadaichi Asai, and he was the son of Iwajiro Asai, manager of the Nankai Shoten store, which we'll hear more about. He expressed, he had become a minister in the Midwest, and he said, becoming evicted from our business place was in itself a great financial loss, but to be torn asunder from our home, our church, and our community was a cataclysmic emotional experience. And giving a face to all of this will be the son of a Terminal Islander, Paul Hiroshi Boyea.
Thank you, Naomi. As Naomi mentioned, Terminal Island is very close to my heart because my mother was born there in 1919. She was the eldest of 5 children. She was a second-generation Japanese-American citizen, also known as Nisei, as were most of her peers. She always reminded me and my 4 siblings that Terminal Island Fishing Village was also known as East San Pedro and also Fish Harbor. Now, most of the men, as Naomi mentioned, made a living as fishermen on Terminal Island, and many of the wives worked in the canneries. Additionally, there were many shop owners of thriving businesses, mainly on Tuna Street and Terminal Way. My mom's father, my grandfather, Sada Hayaku Nakaji, was one of the early immigrants as a 16-year-old coming from Japan in 1905. He originally was recruited by the railroads, but eventually ended up on Terminal Island, going back to the fishing prowess from Wakayama Prefecture in Japan. So in 1936, he became president of the Japanese Fishermen's Association in Terminal Island. And he would travel numerous times to Sacramento to fight against anti-Japanese legislation, which is trying to prevent fishermen from owning fishing licenses and also owning boats. So Japanese immigrants and the Terminal Island families created a tightly knit and successfully self-contained community with homes, stores, businesses, schools, churches, shrines, parks, sports teams, and special events. The Nisei Japanese American children grew up on Terminal Island and lived an idyllic life, learning American customs while maintaining Japanese culture. Now, many children participated in Boys and Girl Scouts, just like any other community, and my mom performed in piano and dance recitals with the San Pedro branch of the Los Angeles Conservatory of Music and Arts. Sports including baseball, judo, and kendo were big forms of recreation, as well as movie night gatherings at the large Fisherman's Hall building, which served as a vital community center. Now, my mom and her peers also enjoyed attending many of the events at the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles at that time. All the schools my mom attended were part of the Los Angeles Unified School District, including the elementary school on the island of Terminal Island, East San Pedro Elementary School. My mom and her peers, they didn't learn to speak English until they went to kindergarten because they only spoke Japanese at home at that time. So they took kindergarten for a year and a half just to catch up on their English skills, and they learned very quickly. The Nisei children also attended additional classes, Japanese language classes in Terminal Island during the week and also on Saturdays. So they were going to a lot of different school hours during the week. Now, when the kids reached junior high school, they would take the ferry across the channel to Dana Junior High School and eventually San Pedro High School. And it's interesting to take a look at these different yearbooks from the 1930s, and you see a lot of the Nisei Japanese American students mingling with other cultures where they got to know each other very well. But that soon disappeared soon after that. Now, my mom held numerous student government offices in high school and earned California Scholarship Federation honors from the San Pedro graduating class of 1938. The Nisei that lived most of their formative years on Terminal Island relate to their upbringing being their furusato, which translates to home sweet home. Now, Terminal Island was a community where everyone looked out for each other and created fond memories. The memories abruptly changed and a life of long trauma was created for the Terminal Islanders after December 7th, 1941. And Donna's going to kind of expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm going to preface by saying we host students and talk about Terminal Island history regularly during the school year. And I always tell the students, there's three things I'd like you to come away with knowing about Terminal Island history. And the first one is, as Naomi mentioned, that the tuna industry was so important to the development of the city, the port, and the Japanese fishermen's contribution was substantial. If you don't believe me, take a look at the LA County flag, which is their seal, and in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a tuna albacore. That's how important tuna fishing was to the city. The second thing is that there was actually two removals, forced removals. One was from the island, and then one was to the concentration camp. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The third thing is, Terminal Islanders are unique in that their community was destroyed. They had nothing to come back to. Now let me pick up where Naomi and Paul kind of left off, or actually I'll go back a little bit. So after Pearl Harbor, things changed dramatically for Terminal Islanders. The military started to control the island. So anybody coming and going had to be checked. And there was a lot of distrust from the government, even though there were at least 25 terminal island men inducted into the military between 1941 and 1942. And partly that was because of the Japanese fishing harbors close vicinity to strategic sites like the Reeves Airfield. There was a shipbuilding company and the oil refineries. Also, there was a lot of unease about some Japanese political groups, Shinto cults, and the Japanese Military Veterans Association. The first thing the military did was they stopped night fishing, so that closed off any sardine fishing. And then, as Naomi mentioned, Japanese born leaders were taken into custody first, and many were detained at the Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary. Some of the canneries started to release the Japanese workers. Stores were padlocked, homes were searched, looking for contraband. So you weren't allowed to have shortwave radios, flashlights, cameras, and obviously guns and ammo. Once the executive order 9066, February 19th, 1942 came down, that opened the doors for terminal islanders to be removed. On January 25th, 1942, they were given the 48-hour notice to vacate the island. Most of them were women with children. They did not drive, they did not have vehicles, they did not have even boxes to store things. A lot of them had no place to go. Hopefully later, I have interviewed a number of original terminal islanders, and they have related their experience and how they felt at that time. Even though they were children, how that made them feel and how they dealt with the issue of trying to get away within 48 hours off of the island. Many churches opened up their doors to take in islanders that didn't have any place to move to. The problem was a lot of places, hotels they didn't want to rent to Japanese. And the only place it could go to was possibly Japanese language schools opened their doors. But it was a very difficult time for people to find housing. So by April 5th, so we're talking like a month and a half later, all of the buildings were destroyed on Terminal Island except for the two Tuna Street buildings. And this was the only Japanese community where the built environment had almost entirely vanished. So after the war, other groups were able to return back to their homes, but for Terminal Island, that was not possible. So the first concentration camp was Manzanar. It wasn't completed, and Terminal Islanders, some of them volunteered because they didn't really have a place to sit, a place to live. They volunteered to go early with the camp not finished. So they helped to actually finish building Manzanar, and eventually there were 3 adjoining camp lots, which was about 800 Terminal Islanders were at Manzanar, which was the largest group of any of the concentration camps. After the war ended, Japanese were able to return home, and they were given like $25 train ticket, and some of the Terminal Islanders came back, and they went to visit the island, and it was all fenced off. So there was nothing left. I mean, you can just imagine how that must have felt to see the whole village disappeared. And there were a few trailers for them to use, but and housing was very difficult again. People people could not find anyone wanting to sell or rent to Japanese. And although they still miss the ocean and they wanted to be close to where they had lived before, so a number of them moved to West Long Beach. And it was difficult to have jobs at that time too. So there were, some of them became gardeners, delivery men, and if we have time later, I can talk about Japanese fish truck peddlers, which is a very interesting occupation. In 1948, there was a Japanese Evacuation Claims Act, and people could try to put in for receiving compensation, but it was difficult because in all of the hustle and bustle of being removed, they couldn't find, or they didn't know where their paperwork to present for the claim. They didn't know where they, or else they didn't have, they actually lost the paperwork that was necessary. So very, very few were able to take advantage of the Claims Act of 1948, which was capped at only $2,500, which is 10 cents on the dollar. So terminal islanders were spread out for the next couple of decades, although they kept in touch. And by May of 1971, a group got together, a group of 23 got together and formed the Terminal Islanders Club. And they had $230 from the charter members, and they held their first reunion a month later in LA's Chinatown. And more than 700 Terminal Islanders turned out. August of 1988, President Reagan presented an apology and reparations to Japanese who were still living, and the Civil Liberties Act, HR 442, was passed. In 2002, Terminal Islanders dedicated the Terminal Island Memorial Monument. It is not located where the Japanese fishing village was, but it is on the island. And today we have 240 members, and we meet 2 times a year. So Terminal Islanders are alive and doing well, and looking forward to getting the historical designation for the buildings and saving them.
Thank you, Donna, Paul, and Naomi. I'd like to now invite Terry to join us and share a little bit more about what the Terminal Islanders Association is doing and why they're advocating for these 2 buildings.
Thank you, Adrian. The Terminal Islanders Association has been around, as Donna mentioned earlier. It was created back in 1971 as a means to bring back the Terminal Islanders that were forcibly removed from Terminal Island back in 1942. To this day, we hold 2 events, primarily a picnic that gathers all the Terminal Islanders as well as their descendants, as well as a New Year's Eve, or excuse me, a New Year's party to celebrate the New Year's. That is a very prominent celebration for the Japanese culture, Japanese community. And in doing so, the Terminal Islanders Association, their original Terminal Islanders had always concern about the descendants, or I'm the 3rd generation and 4th generations. They were concerned. The first generations were concerned about the history of Terminal Island being lost, if you will. We have an opportunity to be able to save the history, the legacy of Terminal Island, particularly the Tuna Street buildings that we're speaking of today, that we're hoping to get a designation. We reached out in doing so with Council District 15, the 15th Council Member Tim McOsker, and to help us in preserving LA's history, particularly the Japanese village that used to exist on Tuna Street. We have been working with the council office as well as with the Port of Los Angeles, who, by the way, they are the landlord of the buildings that we're speaking of. The Terminal Islanders Association feels very strongly that when we have something that we are able to preserve, the history, to tell the story from the previous panelists that have talked about what occurred in a community that they considered as one big family, it's important for us to help preserve that legacy and that history of what took place on that island that was completely changed very quickly in 1942. Working with the city council office has been an experience for all of the Terminal Islanders and the board members being able to reach this point in our effort to save the Tuna Street buildings. The Terminal Islanders Association is very active, most recently in educating the students to tell our story about Terminal Islanders and what they brought to the United States regarding the tuna industry. We use the Japanese monument, fishing monument on Terminal Island. It's on Seaside, about a mile away from the Tuna Street buildings, as our stage to tell our story with performances with taiko drummers, keynote speakers, as well as original Terminal Islanders that were born on Terminal Island. My grandfather was superintendent at one of the canneries when he came to America, as well as my father and his brothers were also fishermen, commercial fishermen on the fishing boats that went out to sea days on end to catch the tuna. So this is an important effort from the Terminal Islanders Association's perspective to maintain and to preserve a legacy, a history. It's an American story. It's a story that many are not aware of, that we believe it's very important to tell the story, to spread the word, and through the efforts of preserving, in this case, two structures that currently exist, is a way to maintain that legacy and preservation.
Thank you, Terry. And if I could ask Aksel if you could join us from Councilman McOsker's office, Council District 15.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Do you want to share, Aksel, a little bit more about the action your office took in terms of the historic cultural monument designation?
Sure. Yeah. So, in the city of LA, we have a process for preserving structures and buildings of historical significance. And this is the historic cultural monument designation process. So this is something that's typically started by the council office at the behest of community members, sometimes the Conservancy itself, and sometimes, like in this case, a collection of folks like the Terminal Islanders Association and the Conservancy as well, who've been working with them for several years. So for this specific project, I've done a couple of these in my time with this office, and primarily in Wilmington and Avalon Boulevard and a few buildings here in San Pedro, but never anything in the Port of Los Angeles property, and specifically never on Terminal Island. And so having worked here for a variety of years, I knew the history of Terminal Island and the Japanese fishing village. And of course had visited the monument several times, but had never had the opportunity to really meet with the folks that were remaining. And one of the most interesting, and I think one of the most memorable pieces of this story for me, is getting the opportunity to join the Terminal Islanders Association for their New Year's party, and getting a chance to meet some of the actual the remaining residents, the original residents of Terminal Island, which I think there's 15 original Terminal Islanders left, and the council member got a chance to break bread with them at this party and get a chance to talk about our partnership moving forward. And so the complications of city government at times bureaucracy can sometimes get in the way of good works. and the council offices always work to kind of cut this type of red tape. So for this particular project, the challenge was that the remaining buildings are on this stretch of Terminal Island, which if you've ever visited or have taken a look or have ever driven over either the International Gateway Bridge in Long Beach or the Vincent Thomas Bridge into San Pedro, it's completely industrialized. Most of the operations on Terminal Island now are basically focused towards cargo, containerized cargo, and whether that's storage or actual terminal space, it's a heavily industrialized area. And so even to find the monument that exists, you have to kind of snake your way through and get onto the island with competing traffic really being primarily commercial truck traffic. And so when I found out that there was still kind of remaining vestiges, physical remaining vestiges of this fishing village, it was a surprise to me. And I'd been working here for a very long time. So I got the opportunity to go visit the site several times before we started, kind of embarking on this process. And there had been kind of an RFI, RFP that were being thrown out for the Port of LA to reutilize the space, to demo the buildings and lease the space out to industrial tenants, basically, to continue the uses that exist in the rest of the island. And sorry, basically every time I'm on a Zoom meeting, and only when I'm on a Zoom meeting, an ambulance happens to go by our building, and I think they actually wait for me to log on to do it. So my apologies for the noise you hear in the background. I'm somewhere safe. I'm in a city building. So that being said, when I got a chance to take a look at the buildings and visit, it was very surprising that there was still a piece remaining. And the port was looking, like I said, to lease these properties out without the buildings on them to an industrial user. And so that was the first opportunity I got a chance to meet with Terry, Paul, and Donna, and heard a little bit more about the history of these buildings and what remained. And so even though the buildings were not in the best shape, we knew that there was a history that needed to be preserved there. And so the council member got the opportunity to meet with the group, heard some of these amazing stories, got a chance to, like I said, meet with some of the original folks on the island when we went to the party earlier this year. And so it didn't take much to really convince us to move forward with introducing this designation process. So not to get too wonky in the weeds and put folks to sleep, but essentially the way it works is we introduce a motion, right? And we request our planning department's Office of Historic Resources to more or less conduct an investigation of the site, the buildings themselves, comb through the records, images, and take into account either the kind of a twofold process. You either take a look at the historical significance of the architecture, the buildings themselves, or historic events that happen there. And so if you see the buildings, you would drive right by them and not know the history, right, just by looking at them at face value. But once you learn the history and seeing that these are the two remaining structures from that time, we felt very strongly that this could qualify for a historic cultural monument designation because of the history that occurred here. So that was the path that we took, and the Office of Historic Resources basically starts their work. They conduct a study, they do a variety of site visits, and then they formulate a report with a staff recommendation, which goes to the Cultural Historic Resources Committee. And there is where they get a chance to vote. The commission gets a chance to vote on whether they recommend preservation of the site. And typically when they do, this then goes back to council for full approval. And then the property is designated as such. And so right now we're at the middle point of the beginning of the process, meaning there's been a site assessment, several visits, and we're looking to go back to the commission in early June. And so that's where they'll make their recommendation. Our office, of course, will speak in support. Port of LA, I'm sure, will as well. And hopefully that goes back to council for a full final approval, and we'll be on our way to designating these important buildings. But they definitely mean a lot to the council member's office. I mean, one of the things that the council member himself has brought up a few times in terms of stories is he does remember the name of East San Pedro being used, and his father actually had classmates and friends that lived in East San Pedro that his father played with as a kid, and he actually remembers and recounts the story to the McCosker family in the past that he remembered just one day a good deal of his friends were gone and he didn't see them again. So if there's anything that he can do to kind of restore that legacy or at least memorialize what happened, and especially in times like today, not to get super political, but we kind of are biting on some of these, repeating some of these old histories in terms of discrimination, that preserving a site like this is kind of a reminder of darker times in our history, and hopefully a reminder that we can definitely do better. So appreciate you all having me, and it's been really great working with the Conservancy and the group here on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Aksel. Thank you, Terry. I'm going to ask everybody to go ahead and turn your cameras back on. Please join us because we're going to have more of a broader kind of group conversation at this point. Again, thank you, Donna, Naomi, Paul, for sharing your stories, for Carol, and the National Trust for supporting this effort by the Conservancy and Terminal Islanders Association to really recognize. And I think hopefully it's crystal clear that this is a story that needs to be told and hasn't been told, and many don't know about it. And actually, you're absolutely right. If you happen to find your way onto Terminal Island, which usually has to be by intent, but if you are there and drive by these buildings, you will not know the story. And I think it brings up a question, about that we're often confronting in terms of the work of preservation and heritage conservation, about what is important to keep, what is important to let go of, and what does heritage look like. And I think it's interesting in terms of some of the conversations we're having right now and what's happening in LA after the fires, where so much was lost. And communities are still talking about, well, no, the community is still there, the people are still there, and the stories and the connections to those places are still important. And now it's been 83 years since what occurred on Terminal Island in terms of everyone forcibly, removed and much of the buildings destroyed. So I'll ask the group the question. I think to some degrees you've answered it, but I'll put it out there again for people that will say, well, why is it important to keep these two simple little buildings that have had some changes over time, but essentially the basic form of the structure remains? Why is it important to keep them?
Andrew,
when otherwise the story is still out there.
Hey, Andrew, this is Carol. Could you please turn on my camera?
Are you able to turn it on now, Carol?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it was just disabled. Sorry. Thank you.
No. Thanks for letting us know.
So Andrew, answering your question, when you think about these buildings, and I think Aksel mentioned, they don't bear any resemblance to what the buildings look like 83 years ago. We understand that because they've been completely altered inside and out. But what they do represent is family, history, and culture. And they also represent the last physical remnants of anything from that fishing village from that era. So that's why it's so important for us to think in terms of how do we rehabilitate these buildings? How do we make them functional again? How do we create an adaptive reuse for the buildings that's meaningful, where we can get, like Terry mentioned and Donna mentioned, we want to educate people as they go forward. So this is an American story that no one should ever forget. This is an American story that people should learn. So by having a physical presence there, and maybe an adaptive reuse of the building could be an educational center, a gallery, perhaps a tenant for the port, could be an office space, but we want to utilize the buildings for educational purposes. And this is the way, again, we don't want people to forget this story and how meaningful this story is to us as descendants and supporters.
If I could just add a little bit to what Paul said from the perspective of the National Trust, it's important for us as a country to create a commemorative landscape that honors the places where our history happened and the global roots of our nation. And here's a place whose stories are incredibly powerful, a community built by Japanese immigrants whose descendants and whose legacy lives on in the culture of Los Angeles and the culture of our country. At the same time, Terminal Island community and the horrific fate to which we as a country allowed this horrible thing to happen, we need to be reminded of the importance of standing firm for our values, for never giving in to fear, and for honoring the rights and the equality and the freedom of every single person. And here's a story that both enables us to celebrate the contributions and the talents and the gifts of Japanese immigrants and Americans to our country, and at the same time reminds us of our obligation to live up to the ideals we claim to hold.
I'd like to add too, I'm an observer. My roots are not in Terminal Island, but I did work on Manzanar, the visitor center there, and do some interpretation. And I will say there is something about actually standing in the place where something happened. It moves you in a different way. And even though I have, I did all this research, even interviewed people, when I actually went to Tuna Street and stood there. And then if you actually go to that area, the street names themselves are kind of honoring the legacy of Fish Harbor. There's Cannery, there's Albacore, which is misspelled, but it's just so, it just gives it a certain life. And I think when we did Manzanar, it's referred to sites of conscious. And I think, tuna, the Tuna Street area, Terminal Island could be such a place too. Just what Carol said, while heralding the contributions of an immigrant group, it can also be a reminder of what our country, our city did at a certain time, a tragic time in the past.
Well said.
Adrian,
Go ahead, Donna.
would this be a good time for me to share what the original Terminal Islanders told me, how they feel about the buildings?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We have at least a few dozen members who actually lived on the island and are in their 90s pretty much now. I'm going to share a few of them, what they had to say about why the building should be saved, and if they had any special memories. The first one is Masako. And she said, when I think of Tuna Street, I remember our cousin's cafe, and above the cafe was the office of our family physician. I made lifelong friends on Terminal Island, and I still meet and see them to this day. Our experience of living on Terminal Island and the hardships that we endured have kept us close. Visiting Tuna Street is and always will be nostalgic for me. Preserving the 2 remaining buildings will mean the story of Terminal Island will never be forgotten. Here's another one. This is Miho. She's also 91. She was born on the island in the 1930s. She still drives to the area simply to remember life before the war. Her mother and 4 siblings were forced into a camp when she was 9, while her father was forced into another camp. When she returned to her home on Cannery Street, she saw that it no longer existed. Terminal Island seemed like one big happy family where everyone cared for each other. I remember Mama going to work at the cannery, and there were 5 of us kids from 9 years old to 3 months. It seemed like we were looked after by whoever was around, even young teenage boys and girls. I am saddened to think of the 2 Tuna Street buildings being demolished. Terminal Island is unrecognizable as the once happy, loving place where I was born, but at least the streets have remained. Having the 2 buildings there when everything else is gone from our village is a huge comfort, since I have visited there frequently since being released from Manzanar. I am going to be 92 this year in November, and I go to Terminal Island as often as I can. Without the 2 Tuna Street buildings, what do you have? Nothing. Alice is 90, and she says, the Tuna Street buildings are very old and need a lot of repairs. To others, they might be just old buildings, and those buildings might not mean as much as they mean to me. There used to be many other buildings on Tuna Street, a whole village. The buildings prove to others that we lived there. There once were many people living there. Terminal Island was the place where I lived. Going to Brighton Beach in the summertime, going to the drugstore were some of my favorite things. I remember always looking forward to getting dressed up in my kimono for special occasions. During the summer, there were festivals. I used to do ondo, which is Japanese folk dancing. And on New Year's, we would go around to neighbors' homes. And I remember that wherever you went, there was food. I also remember a little bridge and people wanting to take pictures on it. I can still hear the whistle from the canneries. Many times I would wake up and my mom wouldn't be there. Then I would get up and get myself ready to go to school. The thing that I feel that is most important that I would like people to know about Panelist Island is that we lived there. There was a village there, because now there is nothing left except for the two Tuna Street buildings. People would not know that there had been a town there. Just like any town, we had stores, churches, and we had fishermen and canneries. And our town was important because of the tuna fishing industry, and people need to remember that.
Thank you, Donna. That's beautiful, and well said by the people that have that connection to the place directly. And, you know, I think about the Terminal Islanders Association, and I think of resilience, and it amazes me of a community that's been gone from this place longer than they were ever there, and still comes together, still is connected to this place. And it really is everything you're talking about, you know, telling the stories and acknowledging that this community was there, that they were there, their stories and their families were connected to this physical place, and that these two buildings help embody that. We always say that without the physical place, the story is less real, it's less tangible, it's less experiential, because you can't go there. And that's why these two buildings do matter. So you all said it beautifully, much better than we ever could, in terms of why these places matter. There's a lot of good questions that people are asking, so I'm going to get to some of those, but one that's come up multiple times, and Paul, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd encourage the broader group to also talk about what do you want to see happen to these buildings, provided the port decides not to demolish and that there's an opportunity to reuse them? What should they become to be able to tell the story, but also be functional and put to use?
Was that a direct question, or?
Yeah, anybody that wants to take it, feel free.
Okay. Like you said, I mentioned that we want to educate people. We want to make sure that we significantly honor the legacy of the Terminal Islanders that lived in this beautiful island. And the way we do that, when you think back on what Terry was saying, the Terminal Islanders didn't really speak about a lot as when we were children. And you think about why didn't they speak about it? Because they were definitely traumatized. I mean, if you go through what they went through as far as being forcibly evicted from their homes, having no place to go to in a 48-hour notice, being put in a concentration camp, I mean, all these things add up. I mean, and it creates trauma. So they didn't really talk about it that much. But then as the years went by, as the Sansei, the third generation, my generation, Terry's generation, became older, they started talking about it a little bit. Different filmmakers started approaching them saying, you have an important story to tell. Different authors approached them, you have an important story to tell. So they started telling the story and finding out that the story is very important to people. And people need to understand the story and to understand what happened. And as we said a lot of times here, to make sure something like this doesn't happen again in the future. But one of the things, when I listened to dozens of oral histories from my mom's peers, these are the ones that were older when they were kicked off the island. So they were born there and they grew up their entire life there from a formative years standpoint. So they lived a full immersed living situation on Terminal Island. So they would tell the stories about what happened, but in the oral histories, you hear them say that the story is going to disappear after the, Issei, and then Nisei is my mom's generation. They thought the Sansei, which is my generation, wouldn't have anything to do with it, and then the story would just disappear. So when you go back and you listen to that, you feel definitely an obligation to make sure that you continue the story, and make sure that you honor their legacy and don't disappoint them, because that's what we're doing now. And that's why we put so much time and effort into this to make sure that these buildings are culturally important. They were important to the descendants, and they're important to the Issei and Nisei of Terminal Island. So as far as what can we do with the buildings, we talked about adaptive reuse, which is a terminology LA Conservancy taught me. I knew nothing about that a year ago. But we want to rehabilitate the buildings to be able to have an educational center, And Donna mentioned we already do educational seminars already on Terminal Island. But this can accommodate a lot more people. If we have educational center, have some type of gallery where we can have different artifacts, different history of the building within the gallery. And then to tie the port into it, perhaps there's a port tenant that may need office space available as well. So there's different things that we're talking about as we move forward to make sure that we still keep historical recognition of the building. It's going to look like a historical building. And that's something that we feel is very important as we move forward.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And Aksel, you mentioned earlier about the effort to have these buildings designated historic cultural monuments, which is in LA, it's essentially a local landmarking process. And one other aspect that we haven't really shared in Los Angeles has about 1,300 plus historic cultural monuments scattered across the city. Roughly 2% reflect an Asian Pacific Islander story. So it really does drive home the point of how much these places matter and how few of these are currently acknowledged in terms of historic places, which brings me back to Carol. And I wonder if you could share a little bit, what do you hope this listing by putting it on the 2025 most endangered list will help us with, and how it's helping with other sites in the past or current list that you've included in terms of other places across the US?
Thanks, Adrian. Well, our job here is to support you and the Terminal Islanders Association to ensure that these buildings are preserved and activated in a way that you want to see happen. So when we identify the 11 most endangered places in the country, that tends to draw publicity and attention and support and sometimes resources to these places. We're able to amplify the stories that you all are telling so that they maybe receive more national attention. And, well over 350 sites have been on this list since its inception, and almost all of them are still preserved. So there's power in visibility, and there's power in amplifying and celebrating the stories that you all want to be told. Our job here is to support you and the Terminal Islanders Association to make sure that what happens in these buildings is in accordance with your plan. And I love Paul's idea of adaptive reuse in some sense, so that there's perhaps office space, but especially the idea of creating an educational and cultural center in the place where this history happened, to Naomi's point, and making educational seminars there. People can go there and learn about the history of Terminal Island and the Terminal Island community. And then we ensure that this really crucial story continues to be told for future generations in the place where the history happened. So that's our hope, is that the dreams and hopes of the Terminal Islanders Association can come true for this place, and anything we can do to support that. It's a privilege for us to be a part of it and to be your partner.
Thank you. And thank you to the National Trust for having this listed on the 11 most endangered. It's meaningful, and I'm sure will be impactful in terms of that goal. We're almost at the end of our time here. One last question, which is a perfect tee up to in the program. Someone's asking, I think Libby's asking, how will the final decision be made, and what can you do to help support the effort? Perfect question. As Aksel said, it's just the start of the process in terms of the Historic Cultural Monument. It goes to the Cultural Heritage Commission in early June. I think Andrew has put a link into the chat that goes to our website. We'll have all the information there for the upcoming hearings and programs and all the details in terms of how you can participate, either coming to the hearing itself and speaking in support of the nomination, submitting comments, or if reaching out to the port itself leadership and asking them to support preservation, and then also reaching out to our friends here at the Terminal Islanders Association. There's many things for people to do here, and so we'll keep you informed. I want to thank everybody for taking part in this. Thank you for everybody that's doing work on this and has been doing work on Terminal Island. for many, many years and decades to ensure that this story is not lost and the contributions of the Japanese American community that once lived there, that their story is told. It's really important and meaningful. And these two buildings are symbols for so much is wrapped up into what remains. And that's why they're significant. So more to come on this, but thank you all. Look for the program in our YouTube. We'll send out a link shortly in the next couple of days. But again, thank you all for being part of this, and have a good rest of your day.